thanks first for all for the invitation to be here, and I made it. Also, I had a serious delay with my flight from Amsterdam, but I was just in time. Yes. I saw now the print of my own introduction, and it is very funny because there is one sentence below that almost looks like Swedish. And it says, een deskundige OR werkt beter. Now, it means, in fact, a competent works council functions better, but that is simply because I used the format of another speech that I had about workers' voice for works council members. And that was also about the need to learn and the need to act in a changing world, so to say. I was involved in the project for the sustainable company, and I wrote, in fact, 2 contributions so far. One for the first book about workers' voice, and the second one was more about the evolution and development of European company law. However, today I will mainly speak about the workers' voice, and I would like to go back at least a bit, also to give a clearer explanation of the involvement of trade unions and why they were involved and to what extent, and also the, let's say, the development of flanking social policy in Europe. I think I was already introduced in the invitation, but I've been involved in the early 90s as a trade union expert in the, in fact, the construction of several of the directives that were part of the action plan of Jacques Delors at that time. As you know, the internal market started, the ideas about the internal market were formulated in the early 80s. And then let's say from the mid 80s on, the economic freedoms were introduced in the then Europe of the 12 member states. And the criticism from the trade unions from the very beginning was that there was only a focus on the economic freedoms, on the free movement of capital, the free movement of goods, the free movement of products and so on, and that there was hardly any attention for the social policy. And especially that was also the argument for the trade unions to say, well, we can go ahead with this internal market, but we need to have a flanking policy. And in the frame of the law's white paper, in fact, a package of 50 initiatives was formulated. And some of these initiatives also had to do with the item that we discuss today. In fact, if you look at, even at some of the directives in the field of health and safety and so on, they often also have a paragraph about the information and consultation rights of workers. We often think about let's say, information consultation rights as something that has to be done in a separate way. Now, if you look at the specific directives that were formulated in that period, there are also clauses once in a while in it about the right to have decent information, for instance, about the health and safety at the workplace and so on. Another argument, I think, for the trade unions was certainly also the fact that more and more companies behaved like global players. That had first to do with the internal market, but secondly also with well, developments at the global level. Certainly after the fall of the wall, you could see that capitalism, in fact, became the norm, so to say, and WTO and so on were the real promoters of free markets and so on. And that, in fact, led to what I think is still valid. The trade union realized that if the workers' co-decision doesn't follow the decision making in a company, then you lose rights, you lose power. If the company all of a sudden has a power center that lies beyond the national territory, then you need also new mechanisms in order to keep upright workers' rights in a company. And that is, in fact, this co-decision has to follow the decision-making structure of a company. That has also been a strong argument in the debates at European level about the workers' voice. And finally, of course, we think and we thought that social progress should not stop at the company door. What is actually at this moment more or less the starting point, if you see that we have gone a long way. I mentioned already the law initiatives at the early 90s. If you look at the first ideas, the first proposals for European Works Council, for instance, that goes already back to the 70s, but was put in the fridge because there was not a majority at that time in the Council of Ministers. So in fact we have gone a long way, but there are some extra arguments at this moment after the ratification of the Lisbon Treaty to say, well, that is a new starting point. The Lisbon Treaty has some articles in it that in fact say that this European Union that we are living in fact also is there to promote social dialogue. That union is there to promote dialogue between management and labor. It says that there should be information, consultation, even participation. You can find that back in the treaty. The question now, of course, is it has to be implemented. And that is one of the, let's say, the critical positions of the trade unions at this moment, that we see that not only because of the crisis, but we are not really having a lot of progress in this area, the implementation of these elements of the Lisbon Treaty, that you could, let's say, give a progressive, positive interpretation for workers. Sig has already said it. In fact, inside the trade union movement, the idea is that binding rules are needed, but there has to also be a kind of unity in diversity, and especially also that unity in diversity it's a bit an obscure word even at the moment, but it says in fact that in the social policy, the things that are established for workers within a territory should be let's say not only respected, but in fact that the European social policy should add to that. And what you see now is that more and more the Commission, especially in the south of Europe, is in fact coming with unilateral, almost dictatorship, also in the social policy field. Although unity and diversity is still the slogan, you can see that well, there is a strong pressure towards, for instance, decentralization of collective bargaining in Spain, in Greece, and so on and so on. And that means that, let's say, the Troika is now directly interfering in what once was a model that was established there. So unity and diversity is, I think, also for the trade union very important. And of course, social partnership. And there again, I must say that although the crisis has demonstrated that in countries where social partners were strongly developed, the northern countries, the Benelux, Austria, Germany, and so on, you see that in fact social partnership now also is under pressure at this moment. Well, if we talk about criteria that have been elaborated in, let's say, in a period of 20 years' time, there is first and for all the idea that European social policy, European social legislation should at least never endanger existing rights. And that also means that if in a company positions are there for participation of workers or whatever, then in fact the developed European company law should at least keep upright these existing rights. The second thing, and that is very much similar, but it is a different thing, is we think that it is necessary, absolutely necessary, that European legislation has an anti-regression clause. What does it mean? That after a while, when there is a norm established that is lower than, for instance, in Sweden, it should not be possible for a future Swedish government to say, well, we are much higher than the European standard is, why shouldn't we lower it down? This anti-regression clause was introduced already in the early 90s in a lot of health and safety directives in order to establish a floor. We accepted that there were minimum requirements established in these directives, but there was an anti-regression clause that said, well, but if, for instance, limit values in Sweden for wood dust are higher, then the Swedish government should not have the opportunity, the possibility to say, well, our limits are much higher, why don't we go down to the European minimum? That's the effect of an anti-regression clause. I must say that I have seen some governments that didn't give a damn about this anti-regression clause and that started to say, well, but we are much beyond the European minimum, why don't we go down to that? But in principle, this is, and this should be, an argument for also for the European Commission to say, well, we have to enter into an infringement clause because these countries are breaking with the law, breaching the law with regard to this anti-regression. Another point that we think that is important if we talk about the workers' voice in companies is that standards have to increase in growing companies. You see that a lot of national legislation, and the most remarkable example is in Germany, it gives certain rights to workers that increase if the company's size is becoming bigger and bigger. In Germany, below 2,000 workers, they have 1/3 of the board participation is by workers' representatives. If you go beyond that 2,000 workers, then it is 50-50. Now, what you can see is that in the legislation for the European company, the SE, this model has not been respected. There you see that, in fact, the rights are freezed, and therefore, in let's say in our philosophy, we think that standards have to increase in growing companies. And then finally, it is also a bit an obscure word, but negotiations in the shadow of the law means that the legislator should never be passive if there is no social progress. The legislator has to play his role in the tripartite constitution, and that is in fact, whether we talk about Sweden or France, is in fact the same. I think there are always three partners in the play, let's say in the game, in the chess play. If the government completely withdraws from the social policy field, then there is no trigger. Very often no trigger for employers to negotiate. So once in a while, I have some experience even in this field where, let's say, the threat that legislation could come made the employers come to the table finally, because they said, well, it's perhaps better that we negotiate and that we come to our own terms, to an agreement. What we see, in fact, in the social field is that in a lot of countries, the legislator is not taking this role seriously. A few things about relevant European directives. I didn't introduce this funny popping up, but anyway, it is there. Over a period of time of, let's say, 20 years, we now have created a kind of frame for, let's say, a more institutional workers' voice in Europe, related to information, consultation rights of workers, related also partly to participation. Well, the first was, in fact, the directive for the European Works Councils, that said that over a certain limit, over a certain size, and also related to the presence in more European countries, information consultation bodies have to be established in EU active transnational companies. That directive, well, it took more than 25 years to get it through in 1994, and then it was transposed in 1996. That directive has and had a lot of weaknesses, but it was on the other side also, in fact, a recognition of this principle that co-decision, information consultation rights have to follow the decision-making structure. If you are part of, let's say, of Siemens, and Siemens is moving from Germany, well, it stays in Germany, but the headquarters is moving to another country, then the German information consultation legislation no longer fits with that decision-making process. And in that respect, you could say that information and consultation as enshrined in the Works Council Directive was the first recognition of this principle. In the meantime, we have established, I think something like 1,500 Works Councils, and the experiences, European Works Councils, the experiences are very mixed. There are really good functioning Works Councils. There are also Works Councils that are not more than, let's say, an annual meeting. Figures are smashed against the wall by the management, and then we have a meal, and then we go home. So let's say if you assess the functioning, then the results are quite mixed. But I must say that I was also 7 years the director of the Dutch training board for national Works Councils. There is not so much difference with how at national level Works Councils function. I mean, there are also at national level you have very good performing Works Councils and you have weak ones. So in that respect, once in a while the criticism towards the European Works Council is, I think, a bit short-sighted. But anyway, in 2002 we got a directive on national information consultation, and the feeling of the trade unions then was that in those countries where minimum standards existed already for information and consultation at the workplace, that this would not bring very much for the Nordic countries, for Germany, the Benelux, France, and so on. At this moment, or in recent years, the implementation of this directive has been assessed, and in fact you could say that this feeling that it would not bring much in countries where there were already more or less sophisticated levels of information and consultation, that is in fact the outcome also of the assessment. And in the rest of the countries, and there the dates are also, I think, important, 2002, 2005. The rest of the countries, I mean also the countries that came in 2004, where nothing was established with regard to information consultation of workers. There, in, let's say, Central and Eastern Europe, you see quite a mixed picture. In some countries, the unions have the idea that it has brought them something, at least, an argument to have information consultation rights in a company. But in some, they say, well, we just have a copy-pasted law, and that's it. It is not filled with practice. It is not. It stays on paper, so to say. Now, and then finally, we had in 2001 a directive related to the newly established European company law. And there is one dimension, I think, very important, and that is that for the first time, let's say, in this whole package, also participation rights came in. Also, the regulation for the SE, for the SE law, and the directive on workers' involvement in the SE had a long history, also almost 30 years. And partly that was because the legislator, majority of the ministers, didn't want to take participation on board. Although in a lot of countries there were participation rights, like in Sweden, but also Germany and so on. Probably Aline will tell more about it. So in fact, let's say if you if you take a bit the this overview, and if you look a bit at it, what has it brought at us in a period of almost 20 years, we at least have a certain recognition of information consultation rights. We have participation rights, but then based on what then was called before and after principle. Now I will skip a few things because I saw that you couldn't read them. There is a lot of information also on several websites, and I will also not take that on board. Although I think that the handbook that we made for practitioners in the SE is also worthwhile for all other people that are involved and working on information consultation, because that handbook is really based on the experiences that we had and that we have in the field also of European Works Councils. I think that I can recommend it to you. But let me skip to still 3 slides before I end my introduction. If you look at the 3 elements, participation, information, consultation, then you could say that we have had some progress, or most progress, in the field of information consultation rights. We have these basic European pieces of legislation, and like I said, also in other parts of the European legislation, you once in a while find the obligation to inform workers, if it is about restructuring, if it is about collective redundancies, and so on and so on. So there are, I think, in total 27 European legislative acts where, to a certain extent, information consultation is included. However, workers' participation as such is in fact still weak. We think, and with we, that is, let's say, the trade unions and researchers that work together with the trade unions, we think that every European Company Law Act should automatically foresee workers' participation, partly also based on the fact that it is now formulated as such in the Lisbon Treaty. The European Parliament so far also has backed up that position. And we think that, let's say, the real code, the determination should always have this negotiation aspect, that it must give, in that respect, the European Works Council Directive gave also the example. It invited, in fact, to negotiate tailor-made provisions, and we think that that is also necessary for the co-determination. The social partnership as such should be a kind of key principle in the legislative act. With regard to information consultation, we can say that it is backed up by several parts of the acquis, but there are still quite some loopholes and inconsistencies. To mention only a few, the sanctioning is weak if information consultation is not respected. We see that different parts of the European legislation have different definitions of information consultation rights, and so on and so on. And one of the, let's say, key activities where and that is really something that is done jointly, the Swedish unions, the German unions, together with the European Trade Union Confederation, are in fact striving for less inconsistency in this respect. And in fact, we succeeded to a certain extent already, because if you look at the information consultation definitions in the directive for the European company, that was much better. It was formulated in 2001. It was much better than the 1994 formulation. And we used it in the negotiation for the revision of the European Works Council in 2008 to improve that directive. So you see that we have step by step tried to get rid of inconsistencies in this area. We also think that, let's say, a much more horizontal approach is needed, and that has to do with the fact that, you probably know it also from the national level, as soon as you talk about social issues, then they say, well, you have to talk with the Minister of Labor. What we try to do is that we say, no, in company law enshrined, and that is in Europe not the Commissioner for Labor, but it's the Commissioner for the Internal Market. We also want these social rights respected and included. So in that respect, you have, ministries are working like silos, commissioners are working like silence. That what we want to do is integrate the social dimension much more on a, let's say, in a horizontal way. And rights have to be guaranteed independent from the specific EU text. That is in fact a consequence of this horizontal approach. The circumvention of ownership is a specific thing that I don't want to go into the details, but we see now more and more that investment groups, let's say, are taking the control over companies, and this blurs the ownership to a certain extent. What happens if a private equity company becomes the majority shareholder in a company? They always say, well, we are not the owner. The owner, you cannot speak to us as the owner. We are not in that. We are not in the game, so to say, when it is about social dialogue and partnership. But this is something that we have to rethink also. I can end up with more information. Well, first of all, it is on the website of the ETUC that we have a lot of information about information consultation going on, social policy developed. I don't think that SIG has mentioned it, but the worker participation website is in a very general way interesting for you if you have to deal in a company with, for instance, with a French mother or with a subsidiary in Ireland. The workers' participation site also gives you monographs of the industrial relations in these countries, and even with some keywords. So if you want to know how collective bargaining is in Austria with this very specific social partner model, you can find that on the workers' participation. And I must say that even I, although I am already for quite some time on the scene, I also use it often just to verify whether what I know about that country, whether it is right or wrong. And in that respect, I think that it is really an interesting and important tool that you can use. We have also a database on European Works Councils that I can recommend. I think the SDA is no longer in the air, but I'm not sure. And then there is quite a package, including a trade union guide on the revision of the European Works Council that we succeeded in 2009. Thank you very much. Well, just in time.